All right, as we ended section 2, part 1, we were talking about the first triumvirate of Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar then eventually became the dictator of Rome in 45 BC. And he was a very good leader, as a matter of fact. The word dictator meaning absolute leader, today's version of that term means that it's negative, and in his day it really wasn't. He did a lot of good things, like gave land back to the poor. He increased the number of senators from 500 to 900, and of course that seemed like it gave more people power, but he knew in essence the more people in the Senate, the more that they would argue. So really it would take away power from them. He constructed or had a lot of buildings done or constructed, and he had military adventures to the east. However, his rule came to an end abruptly on the Ides of March. The Ides of March was on March 15th, 44 BC, and this is when Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators that were really led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. Now, Caesar's assassination is kind of famous because it was so brutal. It was so, it was just violent, as most of the things that happened in Rome actually was. This assassination, led by Brutus and Cassius, really kind of caught Caesar off guard because he wasn't anticipating it all. Now, the reason why they wanted to assassinate him is because he was getting too powerful, and they thought that the Senate would basically disappear in their power, and of course they didn't want to end their power. And so the people wanted Caesar to become king, and they offered the throne to him, or the crown to him, 3 different times, and every time he turned it down, people were even more loving of Caesar, and so that's why he was assassinated. Now, one thing we got from Julius Caesar, besides the saying of crossing the Rubicon, was the Julian calendar. And that was one thing that Caesar had changed for Rome, and one of the months he added, of course, was called July, named after himself. After Caesar's assassination, there was a struggle for power. And again, nobody was chosen, and the Senate had done that, and there was a lot of chaos going on in Rome. So at this particular time, there was a second triumvirate that took over. And one of the people in the second triumvirate was Octavian. And Octavian was actually the heir for Caesar's leadership, and he was his grandnephew. Eventually, he did rule just over the western part of the Roman Republic, but not right at this point. Second person in the triumvirate was Mark Antony, and he was an ally of Caesar and one of his assistants. And eventually, he took over the eastern part of the Roman Republic, which we'll talk about later. And the third person, because you need 3 people in a triumvirate, was Lepidus. And Lepidus was chosen because he was the commander of Caesar's cavalry. And of course, all 3 of these people were connected to Caesar, and they wanted to make sure that Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius and their people wouldn't rule Rome. Now, there was basically a conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony. That was it. Lepidus really didn't have a whole lot of power, and eventually he was forced to leave Rome. And when he did that, he kind of lived the rest of his life in exile until 88 BC. But Antony and Octavian kind of were vying for power, and Mark Antony joined forces with Queen Cleopatra. And of course, Queen Cleopatra, being the queen of Egypt, wanted Egypt to gain the power that they once had in their ancient kingdom. And so she had actually kind of conspired with Caesar as well, and rumors had it that they had a little love affair going. But of course that didn't work out so well once Caesar was assassinated, so she kind of latched on to Mark Antony, and there was a battle of Octavian's forces and Mark Antony and Cleopatra's forces in 31 BC called the Battle of Actium, which was in Greece. Octavian had really very little problem defeating the army and the navies of Antony and Cleopatra, and eventually they both fled this battle area and they committed suicide. As a matter of fact, there is a quote on page 158 that says, Antony was the first to commit suicide by the sword. Cleopatra threw herself at Octavian's feet and tried her best to attract his gaze. In vain, for his self-control enabled him to ignore her beauty. It was not her life she was after, but a portion of the kingdom. When she realized that this was hopeless, she took advantage of her guard's carelessness to get herself into the royal tomb. Once there, she put on the royal robes, lay down in a richly perfumed coffin beside her Antony, and then she applied poisonous snakes to her veins and passed to death as through into a sleep. And so the poisonous asps were the downfall to Cleopatra. So at this point, Octavian didn't have anybody to fight him, and Octavian became the sole ruler of Rome at the ripe young age of 32, and he ruled from 31 BC until 14 AD, and this time period was called the Age of Augustus. And the reason why it was called Age of Augustus is because Octavian was renamed that. Now, the Age of Augustus was a time period where Octavian knew that he needed to try to restore the government, which was the Republic at the time, but knew it could not be completely restored. So in 27 BC, Octavian became Rome's first emperor, and the Senate gave him the title of Augustus. And this is meaning the revered one. He also took on the name of Caesar, meaning first citizen. And so his new name was Caesar Augustus. And as a matter of fact, any emperor after Caesar Augustus also took on the title of Caesar, of course, named after Julius Caesar. And so it kind of refers to as a leader, or later on in the Byzantium Empire, they used Tsar, for example. So on our Greece versus Rome comparison charts, we already labeled that ancient Greece's government was a direct democracy. We also labeled that Rome's government was a republic. However, now you can see that it has evolved into an empire. All right, Caesar Augustus was very popular. However, he also knew that most of his power and control came from his control over his army. And he was the commander-in-chief because he was in charge of the government and the army. And that word is an imperator, which is commander-in-chief. And that is where we get our English word meaning emperor. It comes from the word imperator. All right, so Caesar Augustus was in control of all of the military. He controlled about 28 legions, which was about 150,000 men and about 5,000 troops. And so the legions of about 5,000 troops were kind of the instrument of the Roman army. And the people that were in these legions were called legionnaires. He also was in charge of 130,000 auxiliary forces. He also had a Praetorian Guard of 9,000 men, which their job was to specifically just guard the emperor. And that's a picture of what the Praetorian Guards look like. Now, although Augustus was very powerful, he conquered a lot of new areas. He made sure that Rome was kind of back to that stable power that it once was in the Mediterranean world. He could not conquer the Germanic tribes of Germany. And it was this little dose of reality that made sure that Augustus knew that although they were very powerful, they weren't, limitless. They weren't able to conquer anyone and everyone. And one other thing from Caesar Augustus that we got was, of course, the month of August was named after Augustus. All right, the early empire was, of course, beginning with Augustus, but when he dies in 14 AD, there was a new time period that existed until 180 AD. The emperors at this point in time really tried to emulate what Augustus did, but they really became very corrupt, and they really didn't do a very good job. So the early emperors during this time period were classified as Julio-Claudian dynasty members. And that just meant that they were related either to Augustus or his wife Livia or their families. So the first Julio-Claudian dynasty emperor was Tiberius. Tiberius was Augustus's stepson, and he was very good in the military, and so he was somebody that they definitely looked up to because of his relationship and family ties to Augustus. And the thought here is, if you're related to a good leader, you too would be a good leader, but most of the Julio-Claudian dynasty members were really not very good. As a matter of fact, Tiberius was very reclusive, and he ended up fleeing Rome because he just didn't feel like he had control, and he left Rome without any sort of leader. And so there was some issues there. The next ruler of the Julio-Claudian dynasty was Caligula, and Caligula was Tiberius's adopted grandson, and Caligula was okay for the first couple years that he ruled, but then he really started to become power hungry, extravagant. He was considered to be a little bit insane, so to speak, because he was slightly deaf, and he had a limp due to illness, so he was a little odd anyway, but he was cruel, and he was wild, and eventually he was assassinated, and mostly because of things like this. There's a story that says that Caligula was telling the Senate that they had absolutely no power whatsoever, and he said, you know what, that you guys have such little power in the government, it's all me, that I could name my horse to the Senate, and he could become a senator and be just as powerful as you. And of course he did that, and he was then assassinated. The next Julio-Claudian dynasty member was Claudius, and Claudius was really probably one of the more positive of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and he acquired Britain to the empire, which was a huge feat because, of course, it was across the English Channel, and it wasn't part of the continental Europe that Rome was controlling at this point in time. And the final Julio-Claudian dynasty member was Nero, and Nero was adopted by his great-uncle Claudius, the previous leader, and he too was not very with it, let's just say. He was a little off his rocker. He was so mean and cruel that he even had his own mother killed. The two things that Nero was known for is, one, that there was a fire in Rome during his rule. Some say he started it. Some say he didn't do anything to stop it. And of course, then he blamed the Christians on the fire. The other thing was, from the picture down below here, he had a statue of himself built near the Flavian Amphitheater. And the Flavian Amphitheater, of course, today is known as the Colosseum, simply because the Colossus, or a large statue of Nero, existed outside of this amphitheater. And even though the statue or Colossus doesn't exist today, of course, this Colosseum does. And as expected, Nero ended up committing suicide. It was probably either that or he was going to be assassinated. All right, so on our maps, go ahead. We already have all of these places labeled, and the new place that we need to label is, of course, Britain, which is the island up here, which was acquired by Claudius. All right, the next leaders were called the good emperors, and these good emperors were not called good because they were necessarily good leaders, but they were chosen by an adoptive system. And this was started by Nerva, and Nerva was the one that decided, you know what, let's not have our children or family members rule, because just because you're related to somebody that is really intelligent and is a good leader doesn't automatically make you a good leader. So you have Nerva, who started this new system or adoptive system where they would literally adopt someone that was qualified and call them their son so they could rule. The second of the good emperors was Trajan, and we'll talk about him in a later slide. Hadrian came next, and again we will talk about him in another slide. Antonius Pius, he too we'll mention, but his big push from 138 to 161 was that he promoted art and science. He also had construction of public works, legal reform, and new provisions for orphans. And the final person of the good emperor was Marcus Aurelius. And unfortunately, because he didn't follow this adoptive system and he chose his son Commodus to rule instead of selecting somebody that was qualified, it brought down the end of the Pax Romana, or the 200 years of peace.